Hi, I'm your host, Brent. Welcome to the Climate Guru, where we discuss pressing environmental issues, including with leading experts. Join us for insightful conversations to inform and inspire action in your everyday life. Hi, good afternoon. How you doing, Ashley?
Hey, Brent. Doing great. Thanks so much for having me. How are you?
Thanks so much for joining us on the Climate Guru. We understand that you have quite a background and many years of work and dedication to a number of issues. You're now with Friends of the Earth, right?
That's correct. I currently work with Friends of the Earth US.
And your title is Agriculture and Climate Finance Program Manager of Friends of the Earth US. You work to defund industrial animal agriculture, and we're going to find out what that is. We hear the word industrial agriculture, factory farming. A lot of our listeners don't know what that means.
I might just start, if you don't mind, just doing a very, very quick introduction. You did mention that I'm the Agriculture and Climate Finance Program Manager at Friends of the Earth US. And so we're an environmental and social justice organization. Our mission is to defend the environment and work for a more healthy and just world. But my work really is done through a coalition, an international campaign called the Stop Financing Factory Farming campaign. So I'll just briefly introduce what that is, and then I can get into your questions.
Please.
So the Stop Financing Factory Farming campaign is a diverse coalition of over 30 organizations across the globe. And we're working together to shift public development finance away from industrial livestock production, or synonymous with factory farming, and towards a more sustainable, equitable food systems that really protect communities and the planet. So one thing that I wanted to note is that while most people agree that banks should immediately stop financing fossil fuels, which is a major driver of climate change, I would say the majority of people are not aware that the industrial livestock sector is a massive driver of climate change. And so we are particularly working to get multilateral development banks to stop financing factory farming. And so MDBs, just to give a quick introduction, MDBs, they're international financial institutions. They're owned by multiple countries. They pool capital from many different governments. They lend primarily to low and middle income countries. And unlike commercial banks, these multilateral or public development banks they're not profit driven. They are mission driven. So they are spending our taxpayer dollars to promote sustainable development. They just, in the last year alone, they had invested over $2 billion in factory farming projects, and only 2% of that went to non-industrial projects. So the reason why we're focusing on factory farming is because of the massive climate footprint. So animal agriculture generates more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire transportation sector combined. We're talking depending on the study, between 15 and 20% of all greenhouse gas emissions, and a third of global methane emissions. Factory farms are also driving massive feed crop expansion. So we're talking about monoculture soy and corn grown in fragile ecosystems like the Amazon and the Cerrado regions in Brazil. And that is going to feed the animals in factory farms. And they're responsible for over 70% of deforestation in the Amazon. Right. And what makes this issue so interesting is how intersectional it is. Deforestation and biodiversity loss, freshwater depletion, pollution of land, waters, land grabbing, violation of labor rights, food insecurity. And then one of the biggest issues today is the public health impacts, and how really, because these animals are confined in kind of high density spaces, it increases their stress and facilitates the spread of pathogens. And studies have linked outbreaks such as the avian influenza and swine flu to factory farming. So we're talking about breeding grounds for future pandemics. Right. So this is just to give you a landscape of the issue that we're working on.
Wonderful. So these things meet in the same intersection. Public development banks like the Inter-American Development Bank and World Bank, as well as private banks, are funding a lot of it through tax dollars, a lot of these factory farms. And you have pointed out, and others, that the sustainable development goals of these public development banks don't meet the guidelines of the Paris Agreement. Tell us how the public development banks and how much money they're putting into these private companies, and mention some of the names of the big private companies that we might recognize that are receiving these billions of dollars, as well as private banks, and what countries this financing is going into.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. To give you a sense, In 2024 alone, last year, the IFC, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, they invested over 500 million in factory farming. And that included, they've given a $47 million loan to a Chinese company. The name is an acronym. It's a bit confusing, GXYX. But they've given $47 million to this Chinese company for a multi-story pig farm, 13 stories, that houses over 30,000 pigs and is producing over 840,000 piglets a year. And not only is this inhumane, but the animals are spending, their entire lives scared and traumatized, meaning they have weakened immune systems, and this overcrowding can spread disease. Then another example of a very high risk, very concerning project that both the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, and the IDB Invest, which is IDB Invest is the private sector arm of the Inter-American Development Bank. They've both provided together over $200 million in loans to Pronaca. It's Ecuador's largest meat producer. They have over 115 factory farms in Ecuador alone. And that these loans were for Pronaca to expand their factory farms in an area in Ecuador that's home to indigenous peoples and tropical forests. So just to give you a sense of this impact, these farms are responsible for 4.4 million pounds of animal waste generated every single day. So that's about 80 shipping containers of waste.
We're talking
every
about
single day.
Community in Ecuador. We're talking about the indigenous community in Ecuador with their effluent going into rivers and the dry waste. So backing up a little bit, what percentage of farm animals, whether it be dairy or beef or poultry or pigs, are raised on factory farms worldwide? Is it the overwhelming majority?
That's correct. Yes. In the U.S., it's over 99% of any product you would buy at the grocery store, any meat or dairy product you would buy in a restaurant. It's pretty much guaranteed to be from a factory farm, unless it's less than 1% that has come from a small scale operation or a family farm.
What are some of those names that we'd be familiar with, some of the big factory farm companies in the United States and around the world?
In the US, I think some of the more household names when it comes to meat and dairy would be like the Tyson Foods, the Pilgrim Farms, et cetera. But we really work internationally. So I have less focus on domestic issues. But you asked about kind of what is a factory farm and how do we define it? And I just wanted to come back to that point real quick and say that at its core, factory farming is a form of intensive agriculture that is designed to maximize profits using as few resources as possible. So the entire model is based on exploitation. So we're talking about exploitation of the workers, exploitation of the animals themselves, and then the massive environmental impacts. So that's why we're addressing the issue.
Right. So it's the animals, it's the environmental effects, and also the folks that work there. A lot of underage people, a lot of exploited workers in different parts of the country. And of course, you have concentrated feeding, and they even use chemicals to develop these animals. One of the horrible images I always see are these poultry chickens that they're genetically engineered so that they weigh so much they can barely move. And then they're slaughtered at a very young age. It's hideous. So what do you actually do in order to dissuade them from continuing their loans to these large factory farms? What do the organizations do?
That's a great question. So we essentially monitor new multilateral development bank industrial livestock projects. And then when we identify a very high risk project, or sometimes known as Category A, we will launch what we call an iconic fight, where we launch a global campaign to try to stop this factory farm project from getting approved. So these, what we call iconic fights, are a very effective tool to build our case against factory farming with the bank staff and the executive directors who vote on these projects. In April of 2021, we found out that the IDB Invest was proposing a $200 million quote unquote green loan. This was all for sustainability, to Marfrig Global Foods, which is
Marfrig, yes, one of the biggest.
Yeah.
One of the biggest.
Yep, they're the second largest beef company in the world. And so we launched a campaign in September of 2021 to stop it. We did a big, massive sign-on letter where we got nearly 300 organizations to sign on. We briefed U.S. Treasury. And then after 6 months of campaigning, IDB Invest actually dropped the loan due to citing environmental concerns. This was a very rare move that you actually see a public bank like this drop a project that's already in the pipeline. And it was a huge victory that showed with successful advocacy, we actually can influence the decisions of these big banks. When projects we oppose do get approved, we end up working to develop relationships with local groups in the region. And we move into project monitoring so that we can really track the impacts of that finance over time and produce case studies so that we can, again, make the case to these banks why they should not be financing these types of projects.
So basically, the bank, its directors and executives, they're funded by governments, public money. So they can be influenced and pressured by a public campaign, as well as maybe State Department or other officials of the United States, if you can convince them, Department of Agriculture, what have you, to weigh in on these and pressure them. And you find that in some instances, they are susceptible to these types of pressures.
Absolutely.
Does the public, the ultimate consumer, have any influence on this when you look at the supply chains? And do you ever go through, instead of the development banks, do you pressure the big agricultural organizations like JBS and Magfrey? Do you pressure them directly through publicity campaigns and involve the public and the consumers to try to get them to step back from these farms?
So multilateral development banks, like the World Bank that we've been talking about, and their private sector arm, the IFC, and then all of the leading regional development banks, they are supposed to be advancing development, right? That is their mandate. They're supposed to be supporting the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement. And so the shareholders are the governments, and they're using our taxpayer dollars to support these projects. So, for example, the US is a shareholder that controls about 20 to 30% of these banks. So we absolutely do have influence. We do not, the Stop Financing Factory Farming campaign doesn't necessarily target the big private companies directly. We're usually going after the banks to try to hold them accountable, try to expose the corruption and the hypocrisy. IFC should stop financing that.
To back up a little bit, Pronaca is the fourth largest corporation in Ecuador. It's owned by some very well-connected, influential people. As I recall, they're the biggest poultry and pig growers, one of the biggest in the world. Their operation was just a matter of hundreds of feet away from a local indigenous community, and it was polluting their water, and there was dry discharges on land, destroying land. So tell us how that worked, and how were you able to influence the funders of Pronaca to get them to back off and to protect this community?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm really happy you asked about the Pronaca case. So this is a project that we've been working on with our lead partner on the ground in Ecuador. They're called Sedenma. We've been partnering with them for about 3 years to monitor the Pronaca case. So Pronaca has 150 factory farms, and these factory farms were illegally sited on indigenous territory and have massively polluted the local river that is sacred in the Sachilas indigenous cosmology. So we supported the indigenous Sachilas communities to file a formal complaint, and they just released their final report. And they documented 7 serious violations of the bank's own environmental and social safeguards, including failure to consult the indigenous communities, covering up relevant environmental data, and then the company's failure to address the long-standing contamination of local rivers with untreated waste, because Pronaca was just dumping the wastewater directly into the river. And then actually last month, we brought Ricardo Calasacon, who's one of the leaders in the indigenous community, all the way to Washington, D.C. during the World Bank annual meetings to share his 26 years of campaigning and then his community struggle to get Pronaca to stop polluting his community's drinking water.
How were you able to stop or alter their operations so they weren't polluting the waters and land surrounding this indigenous community? And were you able to affect other communities in their other 100+ farms in Ecuador?
So time will tell. Unfortunately, given the current political situation in Ecuador, there's just a lot of fear. Communities are very scared to sign a complaint. They're very scared to speak out because of the intimidation and the threats that can happen as a result of them engaging in these types of campaigns.
How would you explain the development bank's failure to recognize the problems that were going on locally by PRONACA?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We found that from about 2021, 2023, about 2 solid years of us reaching out, requesting access to information, requesting any details at all about these loans and how the funds were being used. We received virtually no information in response. And it was also further complicated by COVID, but it wasn't until we launched the official complaint that we actually started having meaningful engagement. I think, the IFC, these development banks have a mission to reduce poverty and they have a mission to promote sustainability. And so we are trying to make a very clear argument to them that industrial livestock is actually driving deforestation, it's driving climate, it's worsening, exacerbating these rural inequities.
I'm guessing that in Brazil in particular, deforestation happens in order to create ranches and pasture land, which is the biggest cause of deforestation in Brazil. Of course, you have palm oil plantations as well as soy in Brazil. And then tell us how the farm operation itself creates methane in particular, one of the greenhouse gases. I guess we're talking about cows, right?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a double whammy because they're clearing tropical rainforests too, and then they're burning them, right? And they're clearing the land to make way to graze cattle, which the amount of carbon emissions from clearing those forests and then burning those forests is immense. And then on top of that, they're replacing the forest with methane emitting cattle and also growing monoculture, soy and corn plantations to feed the animals in the factory farms. The whole system is a broken system.
I've read that perhaps 25% of global warming emissions comes from food production. A lot of it is the destruction of forests and even transportation and so on. And so I guess one of the poster children of that would be Indonesia. And can you tell us what's going on in Indonesia, for example, that's contributing to greenhouse gases?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, I did spend 8 years at Rainforest Action Network, which is an organization that works to preserve forests, protect the climate, and uphold human rights by challenging corporate power and systemic injustice through frontline partnerships and strategic campaigns. So conflict palm oil is a term that we coined back when I worked at Rainforest Action Network. Conflict palm oil is the type of palm oil that is the mainstream palm oil production around the world, and especially in Indonesia. And it perpetuates massive human and labor rights violations because the palm oil companies are often forcefully removing indigenous peoples and local communities from their land for new palm oil plantation development. It's also, as you mentioned, driving massive amounts of tropical deforestation and biodiversity loss. It's one of the key reasons that orangutans are endangered species in Indonesia, which is really heartbreaking. A big reason why palm oil is found in over half of the packaged products on grocery store shelves is that it's one of the most ubiquitous, affordable oils on the market. Back in 2006, the FDA mandated the labeling of trans fats. Food manufacturers raced to eliminate trans fats from their products, and then they replaced all of their oils with palm oil.
So which is not as healthy as they claim, right? It's not as healthy as they claim.
Definitely not. We can thank Dr. Oz for spreading that misinformation. But yeah, so that mandate by the FDA led to a 500% increase in the demand for conflict palm oil back in the early 2000s. As you can imagine, the palm oil industry has gone to great lengths to market itself as a healthy oil. And if it couldn't win the deforestation or, the biodiversity argument, it knew that it could at least sell more of its controversial ingredient to food companies that were really kind of catering to the health conscious consumer.
Right. So you're at the intersection of human health, human rights, degradation of the environment, and fossil fuel and other greenhouse gases. So you're at the intersection of everything, and you've found abuses by a lot of these companies of their laborers. As you mentioned, there was even slavery. So if 99% of our agriculture producers, farm product producers that we consume are factory farms, 99%, what keeps you going? What motivates you to keep you going against such big odds?
That's a very good question. Well, I think having become a mother, it gives me a huge amount of motivation to work harder than ever to really try to slow climate change and protect the future of my children. My work is always centered around food and climate and the importance of food sovereignty and frontline communities in my campaign work. And I think living with integrity is really important, and bringing passion to create a food system that respects humans, that respects animals, that respects the planet are all just really central to my life. And I think there's so much darkness and so many problems in the world today, but I think we really need to be a beacon of light and have hope for future generations, and really just every day do something to push for the positive changes and to push for the world that we know is possible. So I just keep holding on to that light and to that hope, and just work really hard every day to try to fight for a better future for my children.
Well, you and your colleagues really are a beacon of light and fighting against incredible odds with some amazing successes. What would you say to our listeners and viewers who are just learning about these issues of factory farms? What would you say to them that's the best thing they can do to join your fight?
Well, I think the good news is that in terms of food systems, we know that factory farms are not the future of a sustainable food system, right? So there are very clear, very promising solutions. We know that agroecology and plant-rich food systems can meet our growing global kind of population increase. It can meet our nutritional needs while restoring ecosystems and livelihoods. So I would say, we've seen that there's studies showing that in 57 countries, farms that have switched to agroecology actually saw crop yields rise by 80%, which is very inspiring. Agroecology is a way of growing food that works with nature instead of against it, right? So we're talking about applying ecological principles to farming, like biodiversity, healthy soils, natural pest control. So we are hoping to really see MDBs kind of move their investments out of factory farming and out of massive agribusiness, meat and dairy companies, and towards more diversified, climate resilient farming systems. We want to see these banks supporting smallholder and indigenous food systems, and also to support localized protein alternatives and fair transitions. And if people want to get involved in our campaign, we would encourage listeners to check us out on our website. It's www.stopfinancingfactoryfarming.com. We would be very excited to have folks follow our campaign on LinkedIn. We're very active on LinkedIn as well as Instagram, and to kind of keep track of how our growing global movement is really pushing development banks to change course. And we would be delighted to have folks join our growing global movement.
Wonderful. Well, Ashley, I want to thank you so much for spending this time with us.
Thank you so much for having me today, Brent. And yeah, stay tuned. We're hiring a regional coordinator in Africa and Latin America. And there's going to be a lot of new exciting growth in the Stop Financing Factory Farming Coalition in 2026. So please do stay tuned and have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Climate Guru podcast. Stay inspired, stay informed, and keep taking action for our planet's future. Until next time, and remember, together we can make a difference.